What's up? Thank you for being here and joining us for another afternoon devotion as we start a new series. We just finished up the 10 Commandments and we are moving on and going to talk about the 12 disciples. So I'm glad you could be here with us. Thank you for watching. For those who are watching live, be sure and leave some messages in the comments in the chat here. If you're watching later, that's cool too. If you got quarter team game questions or just thoughts on what we're talking about, leave something in the comments for us. So we always want to start with what we're thankful for. For me today, I am thankful for just God's forgiveness. I know that I often fall short of who He wants me to be. I'm grateful for His work in forgiving me and in making me a better man, a lot like He did Peter, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. I'm getting some others coming in. Eric is thankful for the USA. Alec is thankful for playing with his brother. So thank you guys for everybody watching. We got these things where we got our quarter team games. If you leave a comment if you're watching later in the comments, if you're in the chat now, leave a comment with what you're thankful for today. You get a quarter added to your quarter team game total. When all this craziness is over, we're paying out quarters just for the thankfulness stuff this week and for our trivia game each week. So anyway, let us know about that. All right, so on to our quarter team game proper. So our trivia questions. Our question last time was how many soldiers were killed in the Battle of Gettysburg? The correct answer was 7,863. Many guesses were far above that. It was the deadliest battle of the Civil War. But correct answer was just short of 8,000. Closest guess, Nathan had it at 1,500. So congrats to Nathan. You get a quarter for that. Today's quarter team game question. So here's the question we're answering today. Leave a message in the comments or in the chat with what you think the answer for today's question is. So tomorrow being July the 4th, there is an annual hot dog eating contest at Nathan's Hot Dog Place in Coney Island. You have the contest. You got 10 minutes to eat as many hot dogs with buns as you can. So the question is, what is the record? What is the record most number of hot dogs and buns eaten in 10 minutes? Most hot dogs eaten in 10 minutes. So there's your question for today. All right, so let's get into our actual devotion. All right, we've got a lot to talk about today. Number one, start a new series, and number two, it's Peter. There's probably more to talk about with him than just about any of them. So first of all, as we sort of start the series, we're calling this the 12 apostles, the 12 disciples. It usually just refers to them as the 12. Means learners or followers. Early in their time, they were more known as disciples. Apostles means sent ones. Kind of carries the idea of missionaries, but an idea of ambassadors. And so as they get later into their ministry and they're called as apostles. So we're going to call this the 12, but we recognize that there's some of both of these guys. They are both disciples and apostles. The other thing that I want us to see throughout all this is these were ordinary men. These were just regular dudes. These were not like your rich, your high class, your highly educated, nothing like that. These were ordinary people like you and me that God used to turn the world upside down. And part of the lesson I want us to see from this, He can use these guys to do what He did 2,000 years ago. He can use us in a powerful and mighty way as well. So I want us to know that about them. All right, let's talk about Peter. Let's talk about just some facts. First of all, was really the leader of the 12. I mean, obviously Jesus is the main leader. He's the one they're following. But among the list in the Gospels or in Acts about the 12 disciples or apostles, Peter's always first, always. That's significant. He's probably also the oldest. There's this story in Matthew chapter 17 where Peter's approached about paying this temple tax, a 2 drachma tax. And it's a story where he ends up going and fishing and finds this fish that's got a 4 drachma coin in its mouth to pay the temple. Only him and Jesus among the group that would have to pay that tax, which if that's true, then Peter is the only disciple that's at least 20 years old. Everybody else would have been a teenager. So it's likely he's the oldest. His personality is one of leadership. So we see that he was a fisherman by trade before following Jesus. He's the brother of Andrew, one of the other apostles. In fact, Peter and Andrew had their own fishing business in partnership with James and John. He was married, probably the only disciple that was married. And we know that late in his life, well, the end of his life, he was likely martyred. And most sources, it's not in the Bible, so we can't say 100% this was what happened, but most likely he was crucified upside down. That's what most sources tell us, that he didn't feel worthy to be crucified the same way Jesus was, which is a pretty big deal. So what else do we know about Peter? He was an impulsive guy. He was usually the first one to speak, right? Never had a problem opening his mouth and jumping out there. The problem was he didn't always follow through with that stuff, right? Very impulsive, very brash, very cocky, but not always great at finishing what he started or backing up what he said. I mean, one story we can look to, just when Jesus is arrested, they send the Roman guard with, which we think maybe as many as 600 soldiers. Peter sees this, and fisherman, not a professional soldier, fisherman decides, I'm going to whip out my sword and take on everybody. Dumb, right? Cuts off the high priest's servant's ear. Jesus heals it, tells Peter, knock it off. And then just a little while later in the courtyard, after trying to take on 600 soldiers, he's confronted by a servant girl around a fire and can't stick up for Jesus and say he was a follower of Jesus there. So comes out guns a-blazing, but kind of falls back at some point. Very unsteady in that regard. Which brings me to another point. So we often know him as Peter. Sometimes we call him Simon Peter, because his birth name was Simon, which was a very common name. Jesus gave him sort of a new name or a nickname of Peter. But what's really cool about in the Gospels, anytime, if Peter's not acting right, if he's not doing well, Jesus will usually call him Simon. But if Peter's doing well and acting in faith and obedience and righteousness, Jesus usually calls him Peter. It's almost like Jesus would pick a name to sort of tell Peter, you're acting like your old self, knock it off, or you're acting like your new self, keep it up. And look, Peter embodied both of those things, which I think is encouraging to us. Like, I have struggles where, there's times where I am not completely leaving behind my sin and my old self. And there's times where I'm following Jesus well. Peter's an example, but there's a progression toward Christ and toward being more Peter than Simon. That Simon was the unsteady one. Peter was the steady one, the rock, which is what Peter means. And I think that's a lot of what Jesus wanted to do there. So what are some lessons as we wrap up here, just quickly, what are some lessons we can learn from Peter? And I think to look at that, I think we can look at what are some lessons that Peter learned throughout his life. And there's three that I want us to see today. Okay, first of all, Peter learned submission. And these are all three things that did not come naturally to him. We read about him in the Gospels. These are not things he embodied. He did not embody submission. When he's asked about that tax thing that I talked about earlier, he's like, I don't think I want. I mean, yeah, he pays it, but does he have to? I don't know. I don't know if he's supposed to do this. But then later on, as he writes, look, we just read 1 Peter and studied that, right? 4 different times he tells us be subject to or submit to. He learned that lesson, and that God shaped his character that way. He learned restraint. That was not something that came easily to him. He was, first one out the gates, right? Always the one to speak first. And yet we see in 1 Peter, he says, if someone reviles you, don't revile them in return. Hold yourself back. If someone is abusing you, you don't seek revenge. Peter learned that lesson. And lastly, humility. That was not something that came easily to Peter. It's not something that came naturally. He was brash. He was cocky. And yet again, we see in 1 Peter where he's saying things like, be clothed in humility. What an awesome example that is of the transformation that Jesus can make in our lives. So I'm not one that a lot of times can relate to Peter in terms of being the brash, outspoken one, but I'm encouraged by the forgiveness, the transformation that happened in his life through the power of the gospel. So anyway, that's our lesson on Peter. We will come back on Monday at 3 o'clock and discuss his brother Andrew. Don't forget to leave your guesses for quarter team games. With the world record for the most hot dogs eaten in 10 minutes. And for those at Calvary, don't forget we're coming down to one service Sunday morning at 10 a.m. So don't forget about that. All right. Enjoy your weekend, everyone. I love you. We will see you hopefully Sunday, but definitely right here Monday at 3. Love you guys. We'll see you later.